Imagine this. You wake up in the morning, check your iPhone, made by Apple, stored on iCloud, financed by Goldman Sachs, but assembled in China by Foxconn. You order a coffee through Starbucks, whose supply chain is managed through Amazon Web Services. On your way to work, you fill your car with fuel sold by Shell, whose oil was extracted in Nigeria, refined in Singapore, and traded through London, all under the watchful eyes of investors at BlackRock, who, by the way, also own part of Apple, Starbucks, and Shell. By the time you sit down at your desk, you've already paid taxes to governments, but more importantly, you've paid tribute to corporate nations. We live in a world where the most powerful entities are no longer countries, but corporations. They issue their own rules, control their own citizens or customers, command resources across continents, and sometimes even dictate policy to governments themselves. Apple's market capitalization is larger than the GDP of most countries. BlackRock manages more wealth than the entire economy of Germany, and Shell's annual revenues exceed that of many developing nations combined. This is the story of how companies became stronger than states, how modern multinationals turned from simple businesses into micro-empires, operating across borders, unaccountable to any one government, yet capable of shaping the fate of all of them. From empires to enterprises. Let's rewind to the 1600s, when the first corporations were born, not in boardrooms, but on the high seas. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the British East India Company. It began as a trading venture meant to import spices from Asia, but within decades, it had become an empire in its own right, with its own army, navy, and currency. By the 18th century, it ruled over more than 100 million people in India and generated profits that rivaled the British crown itself. The Dutch had their version, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, founded in 1602, the first company to issue public shares. At its height, the VOC controlled trade routes from Indonesia to South Africa, minted its own coins, and maintained private armies to protect its interests. These early corporations were literally proto-states, fusing commerce, warfare, and governance. They were the blueprint for what global corporations would later become. When people say globalization is new, they forget. The East India Company was globalization, 3 centuries early. It taught the world how profit could rule politics. The Industrial Revolution, when corporations replaced kings. Fast forward to the 19th century, the age of industry. The rise of the steam engine, railroads, and mass production birthed new titans: Carnegie Steel, Standard Oil, and J.P. Morgan & Co. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, founded in 1870, didn't just dominate the oil market. It became the oil market. At its peak, it controlled 90% of all U.S. refining capacity. It set prices, dictated terms to railroads, and influenced Washington itself. When President Theodore Roosevelt broke up Standard Oil in 1911, it wasn't because he hated business. It was because Standard Oil had become a state within a state. Its power exceeded what democracy could tolerate. But the lesson didn't stick. Each new technological era birthed its own corporate empires: Ford in automobiles, IBM in computing, AT&T in telecommunications. By the time the 20th century ended, corporations were no longer tools of the state. The state was often a tool of corporations. The 21st century, the corporate nation emerges today. The largest companies have transcended borders altogether. They are post-national entities with more citizens or users than most countries, more cash than many treasuries, and influence that rivals the G7 combined. Take Apple. As of 2024, its market value hovers around $3 trillion, larger than the GDPs of the UK, India, or France. It employs more people indirectly through its global supply chain than the US federal government. It controls one of the most powerful ecosystems in human history, 1 billion devices interconnected under its software and cloud empire. Apple even runs Apple Pay, a digital payment system used by hundreds of millions. That's not just commerce, that's monetary policy. Now consider BlackRock, founded in 1988 by Larry Fink. It's not a bank, not a government, yet it manages over $10 trillion, roughly 10% of the world's total financial assets. Through its software platform Aladdin, BlackRock monitors risk and investment flows across more than 200 global institutions. It's been called the most powerful company you've never heard of. BlackRock is so influential that when it moves, markets tremble. In 2020, during the COVID-19 crisis, the U.S. Federal Reserve hired BlackRock to manage its bond buying programs, effectively outsourcing parts of American monetary policy to a private company. And then there's Shell, born from 19th century oil trading, now operating in over 70 countries. Its annual revenue surpasses $380 billion, more than the GDP of nations like Denmark or Ireland. In Nigeria, Shell's presence has been so dominant that for decades it functioned like a shadow government, shaping environmental policy, local politics, and even security arrangements. Each of these corporations operates like a sovereign entity, not elected but obeyed. The power beyond borders. Governments have borders. Corporations don't. That's their secret weapon. A government's power stops at its frontier. A company's power begins there. When Apple manufactures in China, sells in Europe, banks in Ireland, and is taxed in Bermuda, it's not breaking the system. It's outsmarting it. It exists everywhere and nowhere, slipping between jurisdictions like water between fingers. According to the Tax Justice Network, multinationals move over $1 trillion annually through tax havens, eroding national revenues. The result? Corporations accumulate vast capital, while states grow increasingly indebted to them. When the pandemic hit in 2020, governments borrowed trillions to stabilize their economies. Many of those bonds were purchased, indirectly, by funds managed by BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. In essence, corporations became creditors to the nations that regulate them. This inversion of power, where companies bankroll states, is the hallmark of the corporate nation. Labor without loyalty. In the industrial age, workers identified with their nation. In the digital age, they identify with their employer. Global corporations now command workforces larger than some countries' populations. Amazon, for instance, employs 1.5 million people, more than the populations of Cyprus or Estonia. Yet these workers are bound not by citizenship, but by contract. When Amazon shifts warehouses from one country to another, tens of thousands lose their livelihoods overnight. When Apple relocates production from China to India, entire regions feel the economic tremors. Labor has become stateless, just like capital. This creates a new paradox. People vote within nations, but they work within corporations. Their democratic rights exist in one sphere, but their economic fate is decided in another. It's a split identity, citizen by passport, subject by paycheck. Digital territory, the new colonialism. In the 19th century, empires conquered land. In the 21st, corporations colonized digital space. Meta, formerly Facebook, owns social territories larger than most countries. Nearly 3 billion users inhabit its platforms. Its laws are written not in constitutions, but in algorithms. When it changes its moderation rules, speech in entire regions shifts overnight. Google maps every street, Amazon controls digital commerce, and Apple governs a closed kingdom of devices. Their territories are not marked on maps, but in data flows. Think of it. Google decides which businesses appear in your city. Apple decides which apps you can download. Amazon decides which products you can buy. They are not governments, yet they govern. When Elon Musk acquired Twitter, now X, in 2022, he gained direct access to one of the world's most influential communication platforms. Within weeks, policy debates, news cycles, and even geopolitical narratives shifted in response to a single billionaire's decisions. That's not entrepreneurship. That's empire. The quiet marriage of state and corporation governments claim to regulate corporations, but increasingly, they depend on them. Tech companies provide data infrastructure for intelligence agencies. Energy giants influence climate policy. Financial institutions like BlackRock and Goldman Sachs are embedded in central bank operations. It's not just lobbying, it's symbiosis. In the United States, the revolving door between government and Wall Street is legendary. Former Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson came from Goldman Sachs. Former Defense Secretary Mark Esper came from Raytheon. In Europe, the pattern repeats. Regulators become executives, and executives become regulators. This intertwining blurs accountability. When corporate power and state power merge, who governs whom? The result is a hybrid system, not democracy, not capitalism, but corporatocracy, ruled by corporations, masked by the rituals of representative politics. The loops of power. Here's how the loop works. Corporations generate profit. Profit becomes influence. Influence shapes regulation. Regulation protects profit. Money, power, law, more money. It's a closed system, self-reinforcing, self-expanding, and largely invisible. That's why when ordinary citizens protest corporate misconduct, little changes. Governments can fine companies, but not discipline them. They can tax profits, but not rival their reach. Because the truth is, corporations have become too integrated to fail. Historical echoes. The return of the East India model. If this all feels familiar, it should. The corporate empires of the 21st century echo the chartered companies of the 17th. The difference is that instead of ruling spice routes, they rule supply chains, servers, and systems. The East India Company once taxed Indian peasants to enrich British shareholders. Today, data is the new tax, extracted not in coins, but in clicks. Both models rely on the same formula: global reach plus private profit, public dependency. Can corporations be nations? Some already act like it. Apple builds campuses the size of cities, issues bonds like governments, and manages international diplomacy through supply chain negotiations. Google provides services once reserved for public institutions, libraries, navigation, even emergency alerts. BlackRock shapes global investment flows more powerfully than most central banks. Even the concept of citizenship is evolving. Loyalty is no longer patriotic, it's brand-based. People pledge allegiance to Apple or Tesla as much as to their countries. The modern flag is a logo. The future, corporate states, and digital sovereignty. The trajectory is clear. As automation, AI, and digital platforms expand, corporations will increasingly perform functions once reserved for governments, from education to healthcare to identity. Amazon already runs grocery stores and logistics for governments. Microsoft secures defense contracts. Google's AI helps manage smart cities. Meta dreams of building an entire digital society, the metaverse. The danger isn't dystopian fiction, it's dependency. When everything from communication to credit runs through corporate infrastructure, resistance becomes nearly impossible. The line between consumer and subject fades. You don't vote for your overlords, you subscribe to them. The question that remains. So here's the loop that keeps the future uncertain. Can democracy survive when the real power lies beyond the ballot box? When unelected executives influence everything from trade to technology to truth itself, what does sovereignty even mean? Nations once fought for independence from kings. Today, they quietly surrender it to corporations. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: unlike old empires, these new ones don't need armies or borders. They conquer through infrastructure, through the devices in our hands, the data in our clouds, and the systems that decide what we see and buy. The corporate nation is here. It doesn't fly a flag. It doesn't need to. Its anthem plays every time your phone lights up. The rise of corporate nations marks the return of an ancient truth. Power always centralizes. Once it lived in monarchs, then in parliaments, now in boardrooms. And unless the citizens of the digital age learn to see through the convenience, to recognize how capital and code have fused into governance, we may find that we're already living under a new kind of empire. Not ruled by force, but by frictionless design. Not imposed by generals, but by CEOs. And not declared through conquest, but accepted, willingly, with a click of agreed terms. If this gave you a new way to see the architecture of modern power, subscribe. Because in this new world, the map of nations is drawn not by borders, but by brands. And the question isn't who governs the people, it's who owns them.